talking about your life, but let's talk for a moment before we go back to that about Cochabamba itself, because presumably, if you hadn't, okay, thanks, Jenny. If you had, do you want me to use it for Ben as well? Or? No. Yes. Okay. If you hadn't been in Montreal, you might have been in Cochabamba, possibly.
Yes, one of my colleagues from the TckTckTck campaign, Julia Sanchez, is out in Cochabamba at the moment with thousands of others, as we've seen. I think what's really interesting about Cochabamba, and we were just seeing on the pictures that Evo Morales has just taken to the stage, is something that I know the Montreal Millennium Summit is also trying to achieve, is this catalyzation of the kind of new leadership. We've seen, as I was starting to say before, that the incremental change that we've been hoping for over the last 40, 50 years in development just hasn't happened to the scale it's needed. And so there really needs to be a new leadership that comes through that starts to find some of the other solutions, and new solutions, and different solutions, and to be able to articulate those on a world stage. And if in the last 10 years, if we've seen that anywhere, it's in Latin America. And interestingly, one of the main reasons, in my opinion, that hasn't come onto the world stage is the language barrier. Mm-hmm. And we've seen that the world is run in English, whether we like it or not, it still is. The UN may have 5 official languages, but the reality is most of it is still run in English. Most of the NGO campaigns are still run in English. And it's amazing for me to see the coverage coming from Cochabamba now of a conference that is led by indigenous peoples from a continent which doesn't often hit the headlines, by a leader who is often regarded, if at all, by some of the Western governments as a radical that they'd rather not be there, who is taking that leadership role, who's coming out with his ambassador to the UN, Pablo Salon, who's taken strong leadership as well. And they're starting to say, we've got the solutions here. The indigenous people have been adapting to climate change for many, many years. They've got the best adaptation processes in the world. We've got new economic models that we've been working with over the last recent decades. And we're ready to put those on a world stage. So it's quite interesting to see these two conferences happening in Montreal and in Cochabamba at the same time, that both within them have this kernel of what are the alternative solutions? What's the new leadership coming through that's going to start to provide solutions to the major problems happening in the world today?
I remember 20 odd years ago there was a conference in Oxford with spiritual leaders and parliamentarians, political leaders from all over the world. And they were basically thrown together for a week into one of the Oxford colleges and told, well, you created these problems, you have these big constituencies, you solve it. And one of the people who came there, one of the scientists who came there was James Lovelock, who even back then in the 80s was talking about climate change as his key point that he was trying to make. He and also Carl Sagan. And one of the things he said at that time, back in 1988, I think it was the life of a scientist used to be that of a natural philosopher, and that sense of being connected. And he talked about how when people moved into a kind of a narcissistic sort of internal, what's in their head, and what's very urbanized, disconnected from the land, that kind of life, we lost a great deal. We gained a lot of money and stuff, consumerist stuff, and a completely different worldview, and we lost what really needs to keep ourselves profoundly human, and also keep the planet and all other ecosystemic beings and aspects of the planet alive. And I sort of felt, talking to Ben in Copenhagen and hearing that you were yourself going back to a life that was more connected and more holistic, this seemed to be what many of us were trying to do. And the fact of having the Bolivian conference, which is all about Mother Earth's rights, and then people's place in that, rather than starting just with people and, oh, by the way, there's the planet or there's the ecosystem. This seemed to be a real profound change, and I wondered if you could talk both about that, but also to talk about, Cochabamba from that perspective.
No, it's very interesting, the idea of natural philosophy, and as opposed to almost intellectualism, or this very Western form of intellectualism that's dominated the debate for so many years. And we saw that in Copenhagen when the Bolivian delegate in Copenhagen stood up and started talking about Mother Earth. You see not just delegates from the richest countries in the world, or as Tony Oposa from the Philippines says, the over-consuming countries. You won't call them developed countries, the over-consuming countries in the world. Not just their delegates, but also, if I can be blunt, a lot of NGO delegates based in the north, in the over-consuming countries, kind of rolling their eyes and, oh, this Mother Earth thing, because it is a much more holistic philosophical approach to change. But that's where I've come to as well in my approach to change. And as you've alluded to, I've moved away from what we call the conference circuit, you know, spending my life in Heathrow Airport, jetting off to X, Y, and Z country, and I'm now spending much of my time developing my own small holding, my own farming area, to be able to, for me to reconnect with the ecosystem that we rely on. And I think what maybe James Lovelock was getting at, and what certainly a lot of the messages coming from not just Bolivia, but from across Latin America about Mother Earth, we are one part of a phenomenally complex ecosystem. And we can try to believe that we can create systems that will dominate and control and mentor that complex system, but we never can. Nothing that we have invented has not already been invented by nature. Nothing that we'll create cannot be destroyed by nature, as we've seen from the volcano recently. I was thinking of, as I came over here, some thoughts, and I sort of thought I was thinking of the economy, and I thought there's always cracks appearing in the economy, there's always cracks appearing in the environment, and then of course really there's always cracks appearing in the earth, and this volcano has just grounded all air transport, and we are so reliant on it. So we have to get back to a place where, as campaigners, if I can talk as campaigners, I'm a campaigner, and as campaigners we have to understand that nature is more powerful than we are, and we have to find ways to use the complex legal systems we have, which are going to be important, because at the end of the day we're in a state-based system and we need governments to, if not take a lead, at least to do what they can to make sure that we've got the systems in place that will enable us to go back to a more of a low-carbon society. But enable to get to that point, I think we have to understand it ourselves. And I think if we spend all our lives in air-conditioned conference centres and having these very highfalutin and interesting, but very highfalutin intellectual conversations, we can forget that very easily. So I'm privileged to have the opportunity now in my life to spend 3 or 4 days a week at the moment growing food, working with animals, understanding the ecosystem that I come from. And I think that's where, in a slightly different way and in a much grander way, that's where this conference in Cochabamba is coming from, this plea to people to recognise that we are part of a phenomenally beautiful and complex natural system.